Hamas and Israel. All right, so we're coming to you, obviously, I mentioned in May of 2021, and once again, Hamas is lobbing rockets at Israel for the last couple of weeks. I think actually in the last 24 hours, they've just announced some type of ceasefire. And, you know, this has been, for most of my adult life, this has been the narrative. Israel, well, this is the narrative in the media and usually or most recently by the left, you know, whether that's Democrats or progressives. Israel is stronger. They get funding from America. They're pro-America. They're pro-Western. So therefore, they are the oppressors, and the Palestinian people are the oppressed. And to be clear, we can go back historically and we can talk about what happened after World War II, but there's really no reason for a history lesson. You can read it on Wikipedia. And, you know, to say the Jews got fucked in World War II is kind of the understatement of the century. Basically, 2/3 of all ethnic Jews were wiped out during World War II. And they kind of needed a place to go. So the powers that be, you know, basically the precursor to what became the UN, the people that won the war, they kind of established Israel as an independent nation. There was always all kinds of disputes over the people that were left in Israel or who were in Israel, because there were Jews in Israel, there were Palestinians in Israel, although I don't think they called themselves Palestinians then. Basically Muslims. You know, there's just been a lot of dispute over territory. And what kicked off this most recent dispute, despite what you might have read in the media, is there's a pending case in the Supreme Court on 6 houses going back something like 70 years and who owns these houses, right? Like first it was owned by somebody local. I don't know, maybe they were even Bedouins, owned the local area, and then there's like these 6 houses that were owned, and then they were occupied by Jews when Israel became a nation state, and then there was some type of skirmish and they were taken over by Palestinians, and now that area, or that settlement as they're frequently called, is being resettled by Jews. So now the heirs, or the children or the grandchildren of the people that were kicked out of those houses now want those houses back. And this has been going on. It's been in the form of the Israeli Supreme Court. I think they actually call it the Supreme Court. It's been going on, like this case has been going on for decades, and it's about to be heard by the Supreme Court. And there's a lot of concern that the Supreme Court is going to set precedent for, you know, do Palestinians get to retain ownership? Do Jews who were driven out of certain settlements during certain skirmishes going back historically, do they have the right to go back and reoccupy? Like it's a big issue. I don't want to say it's not. But what we're basically talking about is like gentrification and property rights. There wasn't some civil rights massacre in the streets where the IDF, the Israeli Defense, what does the IDF stand for? Israeli Defense Federation? Oh, that's the Israeli military, but
Israeli Defense Forces.
Oh yeah, there you go. Duh. Israeli Defense Forces. Sorry, my military history is not great today. Had one too many Modelos. So the IDF, you know, it's not like they pulled out a bunch of Palestinians and executed them in the streets. There's no human rights violation or civil rights violation here, right? It's like there's a court case coming up that basically at the root of the issue is property rights and gentrification, right? For decades, these settlements have been going back and forth, and, you know, Jews have been trying to push out into more settlements, and they've been willing to give up this and they've been willing to give up that, but they're not willing to give up this. And it's very complicated. There's people infinitely smarter than me that have multiple PhDs in this area that they can't explain all the nuance going back 80 years and all the geopolitical problems. And then you go back historically even further to like biblical times, and there's all kinds of, I mean, there's just a lot of shit going on, right? And I'm not going to say that at various times, both sides of the argument haven't been up to some type of shenanigans or some type of fuckery. And I'm not going to say that the Israelis are without sin in this conflict, right? There's definitely been, anytime there's war, anytime there's guns, anytime there's bombs, anytime there's soldiers, there's going to be horrendous acts perpetrated by both sides, right? I'm not giving Israel a full pass here. But the bottom line is there's like a court case coming up. And I think, personally, this is my opinion, I think because America has taken a less aggressive stance in supporting Israel, and under Trump, one of the things I like that he did was he cut off all foreign aid to Hamas and the Palestinian Liberation Front. That's where it is, the PLF. Can you look that up, Chris? I don't want to get this wrong. PLF, PLA, Palestinian Liberation. It's very ancestral, right? Because like Hamas is a recognized terrorist group. Like if you go to the CIA website or the National Security Agency website, or you look at a travel agency.
Yeah, PLF.
PLF,
Liberation Front.
Yeah, Palestinian Liberation Front. If you look at that, Hamas is a terrorist organization recognized by pretty much everybody except for Iran and Syria as a terrorist organization. But Hamas is also a political party in Palestine. So the Palestinian Liberation Front, it's all very incestual. It's very confusing. One of the things I like Trump did was, because of the death of this ex-soldier, this veteran who was in Israel, got killed by a Hamas terrorist. Trump used that as an excuse to cut off funding to the Palestinians and said, hey, basically the Palestinian treasury or the Palestinian budget allows for them to compensate the family of people who commit terrorist acts. So, for example, you're a suicide bomber, you go in, you blow up a Jewish synagogue, or you set off a car bomb in a public square. The family of the deceased, or the suicide bomber, the criminal, they get compensated from the PLF for, they don't call it obviously compensation for terrorism, but they have some rosy way that they frame it. But basically, you're paying for people to do terrorist acts, and then your family's taken care of, right? So you can imagine if you're living in a poor country and you're religiously and kind of radicalized, if you're very religious and radicalized, and then you're like, you don't have a lot to look forward to, you can barely pay for your family, you can barely afford to live, and you're like, well, if I go do this terrorist act, not only does that serve my perverse version of my God, and it makes me kind of a martyr, but my family will be taken care of, right? It's really dangerous. So Trump cut off all funding to the PLF and to Palestine. As soon as Biden got into office, he reauthorized $100 million worth of funds to go to Palestine. And again, this is all worded in the way of infrastructure and humanitarian aid and whatnot, but we kind of know where the money is going. Okay, just like follow the money. So anyway, so that happened. So I think this is kind of emboldening Palestine. But this stuff on the settlements, and I want to go to this map actually. So for those of you that are interested in doing historical reading on this, I would really read about the 6-Day War, right? Because the 6-Day War really exemplifies the struggle, and obviously the 6-Day War was with Egypt. It was not with Hamas. Hamas, I don't even think it was a titled branch of terrorism back in 1967 when the 6-Day War happened. But this is kind of like symptomatic of what Israel's been dealing with since the beginning of their formation after World War II. And effectively what happens is Egypt in 1967 has decided they want to wipe Israel off the map. And I believe at the time it was going to be like a 3-pronged attack from Jordan, either Syria or Lebanon, and Egypt. But Egypt was the one that was amassing tanks. And Israel basically intercepts transmissions that these tank brigades are headed for Israel, and they're going to roll through the country, and they're going to wipe Israel off the face of the map. So Israel counterattacks, right? And this is what has happened over and over again. And to tell you the truth, Israel might have even done the preemptive attacking, because like the tanks are rolling through the desert coming to them, and Egypt might not have technically fired a shot yet, but they intercepted transmissions that like these tanks are going to roll through Israel and kill all the Jews. And they had just gone through World War II 25 years earlier and seen 2/3 of all Jews killed. So they're probably going to react pretty aggressively. So they get planes in the air. And this interactive map, there's a really great interactive map at geocron.com. You guys should check this out. You can go all the way back to 3000 BC before Christ, and you can do an interactive map year by year of what countries grew and expanded and what territories and who was owned by what. So you can see here that this is Israel, this little tiny purple dot in the middle, right? And it's kind of funny to me, although I do feel for anybody who's getting displaced, who's getting their home taken away because the Jewish settlements are expanding. But when they say that the Jews are occupying Arab land, I mean, look around here, right? You've got Turkey, you've got Iran, you've got Iraq, you've got Saudi Arabia, you've got the Sudan, you've got Egypt, all this area, everything you basically see on this map other than Greece. You've got Afghanistan over here. Yeah, everything you see on this map, except for this little tiny corner of Greece and this little tiny corner of, I think that's Italy. All of this is all Muslim, all of it. All of it. And this is Israel right here. So in 1967, you can see this purple right here is Israel, and Egypt is about ready to attack. And this green right here, this is the Suez Canal. This green right here is all Egypt. Well, look what happens in 1968. Israel basically doubles in size because in the counterattack, they destroyed Egypt, right? Like Egypt thought they had figured out what the military capability of Israel was. And if you read about it in the 6 Day War, it's really fascinating. What ended up winning the war for the Israelis is they found a way to be more efficient with reloading and refueling planes. So they were able to refuel and reload with bombs these planes like 4 times as fast as the Egyptians had believed they could. So by the time the Egyptians rolled up to the border of Israel, all their tanks and all their heavy equipment was destroyed. And Israel, in the counterattack, basically said, okay, fuck you. If you're going to threaten our sovereignty as a country, we're going to take back this buffer, this east side of the Suez Canal. And Israel doubles in size in 1968, right? So yes, Israel did occupy Arab land, but they did it because they were protecting their sovereignty. It's kind of like if I find out my neighbor's got a gun and a knife and he's coming over to rape my daughter, and in the counterattack of repelling my neighbor, I kind of kill him and take his house, it kind of feels like fair game, right? Like, yeah, I doubled the size of my lot. I now have 2 houses instead of 1 house. But the way that I did that is because I killed my neighbor because he was about to rape my daughter. I kind of call that fair game. But look at this. This is kind of interesting. As you fast forward through the years, so 1970, 71, 72, 70, I think it's in 77 it happened. So in 75, they give back part to Egypt. 76, they give back more of Israel. 78, 79. I think by 84, if you go to, by 84, Israel shrinks by half of its size once again. And then as you fast forward again, I think at some point in the 90s, they give up certain parts of like Gaza, the West Bank. There's certain territories that they give back to Palestine, or they kind of agree to like just not expand settlements there. But this is a really interesting interactive map where you can see how the country was really small. The only time that they grew was when they were getting attacked and threatened with getting wiped off the face of the earth. And now they're basically where they're at, right? And this has been the ongoing narrative my entire adult life. Hamas, for whatever reason, whether they have a legitimate gripe over some settlement or they're getting new funding by the US or Iraq or Iran or whoever's using Hamas as like a proxy state to fuck with Israel, they start launching rockets indiscriminately, right? And Chris, maybe you can bring up that picture of the Iron Dome. Just Google Israel Iron Dome. And what you see in the Iron Dome is you see all these kind of like squiggly lines, which are a bunch of these homemade rockets being launched from Palestine or from Hamas indiscriminately into Israel. Like they're just trying to launch anything they can to create any type of destruction they can. And it's indiscriminate. They don't care if they kill citizens. They don't care if they kill kids. And then there's an Iron Dome, which is not really an Iron Dome. It's an Iron Dome with other missiles that comes straight into the air. And it's really, if it wasn't so disgusting, it would almost be beautiful in the execution. And the only purpose of the rockets that Israel is firing is to shoot the rockets out of the sky that Hamas is shooting into Israel, right? So think about this for a minute. Hamas starts the attack. They're firing indiscriminately. Israel launches all these countermeasures to try to blow up these bombs in the air. And after a couple of days, they're like, fuck this. We're over this. We're going to start bombing you back. And all along the border, by the way, I have to tell you about my Israel story in a second. All along the border of this conflict area, there's all these tunnels and there's all kinds of like human shields being used by Hamas where they'll put their headquarters in a school or in a church or a hospital so that if they get bombed, it's just horrible PR because, of course, then civilians die, and that's always horrible in war. But it's like one side's trying to protect their citizens from getting bombed, and one side is using their citizens and shooting human shields. It really just feels that simplistic to me, right? And I'll tell you, there's a couple things that again, I'm not a scholar on this area. I barely graduated high school, but there's a couple things that have really helped me boil this down. One is a great friend and mentor of mine is about a 70-year-old Jewish guy. And he's Jewish by ethnicity. He's an Ashkenazi Jew, but he's not super involved in the Jewish faith. He's not like a hardcore Israeli. He's an American Jew. So, he obviously thinks Israel has the right to exist, the right to defend themselves. I think he would agree with just about everything that I'm saying tonight, although he'd probably correct some of my historical references. But he's not like the super rah Zionist, we have to have our space, although he thinks they have the right to exist. And he's really helped educate me on this. And then, this is actually very cool, back in 2000 and when was this? I think it was 2012, 2013. I had a buddy who I was really close with in Boy Scouts, and we kind of lost touch with adults as adults, but luckily one of my other close friends kept in touch with him. And this dude's awesome. He did West Point, then he did Ranger School, then he did Special Forces School, couple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, just like legit Green Beret, like straight out of the movies. And in between, he became an officer, and then in between, I can't remember what it is, like captain and major or major and lieutenant colonel, you're kind of encouraged to go get some additional formal education. So you go to West Point, you go into the field, you become an officer, or he became an officer after West Point. He served in the Green Beret teams, and then they're like, all right, cool. Now you got to kind of either go back to the war college or you got to get a master's degree or something like that. So he chose to get like an international studies in political science, and I swear to God, he's going to work for the CIA one day. That's why I don't want to mention his name. But basically like psychological warfare and kind of operations in war theaters. He got a degree in Israel. And so I got to go out and stay with him for, I think it was like 2-3 weeks. And it was so cool because one, he had been there for a couple of years. He had been studying in Hebrew at a Israeli school. And he had all the diplomatic papers of like a special liaison to the IDF and the Israeli Defense Force. And so everywhere we went in Israel, we got like the special treatment. I don't know if I can ever go back there again as a tourist because we went, for example, we went to Bethlehem. And a lot of people don't know that Bethlehem is under Palestinian control. You know, Bethlehem, like probably the most important city in the Christian faith, you know, that little manger where Jesus was born, that's actually under Palestinian control. And so when you drive into Bethlehem, there's checkpoints, and then when you drive out, your car has to get searched, and there's military stuff, and it's very uncomfortable. Unless you've traveled to Mexico and been pulled over by federales who have machine guns, this is a brand new experience for most Americans. But luckily I'd been to Mexico several times and gotten pulled over by federales, so I was used to my car being searched by people with machine guns. But because he had the diplomatic plates and all their credentials, it's like we went right in and right out. We went to the church. I don't know what the church in Bethlehem is that's built over the supposed site of the manger. Maybe you look that up, Chris. The church of Bethlehem, I think it's controlled half by Armenian Christians, ironically, and half by Jews, I think. I'm not sure. Anyway, they fight sometimes with brooms. Funny story, but we'll post a video to that. And so we went in, and there's like a line out the door.
Church of the Nativity.
Church of the Nativity. There you go, in Bethlehem. So like line down the street, he just walks up with his diplomatic papers. We went straight to the front of the line. It was very cool. And being there, you know, everything in Israel is political. They have like 2 different types of beer. Like there's 2 different versions of Coors Light, depending on like what neighborhood you're in. You only ask for this one. Everything, because it's all political. Everything in Israel is political, right? And so what's funny is that when I get tan, I can get pretty brown and pretty dark. And before my hair started thinning a couple of years ago, when I let it get longer, it's very like frizzy and nappy, and I have this very curly hair. So everywhere I went in Israel, everybody just assumed that I was part of their local tribe, right? So the Armenians talked to me in Armenian. The Palestinians tried to speak to me in whatever Arabic language they spoke. The Jews tried to speak to me in Hebrew. The Americans assumed I was American. It was a really kind of unique experience, like walking through Jerusalem. And as we walked by every little shop or store, trinket, whatever, like everybody just started talking to me in their native tongue because they thought I was like their native tongue. I guess I should have been a spy maybe. But it was a unique experience. And I didn't have a strong opinion when I got to Israel about the conflict and what was going on. It was very interesting driving through certain Israeli communities and finding out for the first time ever that there's 2 million non-Jews that live in Israel. There's a shit ton of Muslims that live peacefully in Israel. There's Palestinians that live peacefully in Israel. There's Palestinians that commute into Israel because they can get better jobs there, right? Like everything I saw, boots on the ground, Israel's not the problem. And so I came back and I really did a lot of reading about this, and I read a bunch of Wikipedia pages, and I read a couple books, and I had a lot of conversations with this mentor of mine who's Jewish. And I was really trying to boil it down to like, what's just the essence of the conflict, right? And here's what I came up with, and here's what I'll leave you with, because I think all of this can get into like, what's the political left saying, and what's the political right saying, and what's the media saying. And, you know, in our new kind of Marxist doctrine and everybody having to be critical race theory and cross-sectionality, it's like everything has to be about who's the oppressor and who's the oppressed. And hey, just because Israel's bigger and has better weapons and gets a lot more funding from the United States doesn't mean that they're morally inferior to the little guys, right? Like in America, we love rooting for the little guys. And I think that's one of the reasons that like the Democrats frequently side with like, oh, the poor oppressed Palestinians, just because they're lower on the socioeconomic totem pole than the Israelis are. But that doesn't mean they're right. Just because you're the underdog doesn't mean you're right. And so I was trying to boil this down, and here's what I came up with. Again, going back to this map where everything surrounding Israel is Muslim, and then Israel's Israel. And what I really synthesized it down to is I was like, okay, if all of these Muslim countries and the Palestinian areas and the settlements, if they laid down their weapons tomorrow and they never fired another shot at Israel, yes, there would be some gentrification. Yes, there would be some settlements that overreached. Yes, there would be some encroachment, and there would probably be some disrespect to some holy sites. Yes, I believe all that would happen. But in general, Israel would invite these people into their society, into their economy, into their working class of people, because we already have proof that they've done it with 2 million non-Jews that currently live in Israel. We have proof. We have a thesis for this, right? We have, oh God, it's so frustrating. If everybody laid down their weapons and stopped fucking with Israel, they would welcome them into the economy and into the fabric of their culture. If Israel laid down their weapons tomorrow, they would cease to exist as a country and as a people within 30 days. It would be the Holocaust all over again. If you give, Jordan's actually a pretty cool place. They don't seem to be angry Muslims that are trying to attack anybody anymore. But if you gave Syria, probably Iraq, definitely Iran, probably Lebanon, probably not Egypt anymore, so that's cool, and definitely 100% Hamas. If you gave them a free-for-all and Israel laid down all of their weapons and all of their defense systems, Israel would cease to exist as a company, or would cease to exist as a country, and 8 million Jews would be wiped off the map as quicker than the Holocaust. And so I try to remove myself from all the noise and the politicalness and is that a word, politicalness? Yeah, I think so. And the media filtering their own views onto it. And I'm just like, hey, what's the core message here? Who laid down their weapons? What would happen? And that's what I came up with. So, for what it's worth, my humble, uneducated opinion, I guess I just stand with Israel.